Thanks a lot, Malia. Thanks a lot, Kristin. As they just said, my name's Corey, and here to talk to you about how we can advance towards a smarter and more sustainable transportation system, and how we can use micromobility, specifically electric bikes and scooters, to help us to get to that smart city of the future. Right. So just a little bit about myself. So they introduced me, but I always like to talk about myself at the beginning, just to give everybody some context. So I did my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, and while I was there, I focused on autonomous vehicles. So I did my PhD in that. I did it under the guidance of Chris Hendrickson. He's really well known in this field. But I did my PhD in connected automated vehicles with the Traffic 21 Research Institute. And when I was done, I went through undergrad, grad, and master's. I never really took a break. All my summers I had done research. So I wanted to get some different experience. So I went to Booz Allen for a few years to help them support the United States Department of Transportation, Department of Defense with technical and policy issues related to cyber physical systems, especially helping them with the integration of connected and automated vehicles into our transportation system. While I was there, I was working a lot, and I didn't think that was the career for me long term. And I enjoyed research, and I enjoyed engaging with students and mentoring. I came back in 2019, did my postdoc at Carnegie Mellon, and in 2020. I became a director of the Future Mobility Systems Lab, where I've expanded my research vision and horizon to not only look at AVs, but also look at resilience, rare events, micromobility, multimodal transportation systems, transit, and I try to develop some decision-making tools for different stakeholders and policymakers to use to help us to get to that smart and sustainable transportation system that we all envision. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my vision and some of the micromobility research that we're doing, right? So what my research does, it uses systems modeling to help stakeholders make more informed infrastructure and policy decisions so that we can have a smoother transition to more sustainable and equitable smart cities. And if you look at this graph, it captures what I think are some important components of a smart city from a systems perspective. So for example, smart economy and living talks about job opportunities and access to reliable transportation options. Smart design refers to cities being designed with people and pedestrian safety at the forefront. Smart mobility and environment talks about improving congestion and reducing energy use in our transportation system. And smart governance talks about the policies that shape the sustainability of our transportation system. And today I'm going to walk you through how my research can help us transition towards the smart city. So in this graph, you have smart city components, and they're all interconnected. So in the blue, you have the transportation system components, and in the green, you have those components that interact with the transportation system and vice versa. My research looks at the links between these components. So for example, my research looking at automated freight platooning technologies lets us know how automated vehicles can impact congestion on highways. And my research using high resolution rainfall data helps us better understand how heavy rainfall events could impact traffic flow. And people are at the top of this list because the goal of my research is to improve quality of life for people by looking at the emerging trends in transportation. So today, I'm going to first go over an introduction about micromobility modes and how they could change the way we envision our cities and communities. Next, I'm going to discuss some of the micromobility work that I'm doing now that was recently published, looking at how they can replace short car trips and their impacts on congestion and emissions. And finally, I'll talk about some other tools that I'm developing to improve usage and adoption of shared micromobility systems in our urban areas. So in this graph, we have 2019 US greenhouse gas emissions by sector, right? So you have your industry, your power sector, your agricultural sector. And what you'll see is that transportation makes up the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions currently, right? So power makes up about 25%, that's your second. Transportation makes up about 29%. So transportation sector is almost 20% more than the next largest sector. And the reason this is because many of today's vehicles are powered by liquid fossil fuels, and these are major contributors to increase concentrations of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And this has led to a really big change in our climate, right? And if you look on the right, it also breaks down which mode of transportation is having the biggest impact on this share, right? And if we look at it, medium and heavy duty trucks are having a pretty big impact, but the most significant impact right now are passenger and light duty vehicles. So these are things that people are doing on a daily basis from driving their personal vehicles. The change could have several negative consequences. Some consequences include rising temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns, severe droughts, increased frequency and intensity of hurricanes. And you also have sea level rise in places like Miami occurring because of this. And all of these situations impact quality of life for many individuals, right? So for example, on the left, you have some of the wildfires in California that occur yearly because of severe droughts. These impact quality of life by impacting local air quality, but they also impact the natural ecosystems that occur in these areas. On the right, you have an example of rainfall, heavy rainfall in Pittsburgh, right? Pittsburgh is a place where it's raining a lot, but recently we started to see an increase in the number of rainy days, right? So in 2018, it was the wettest year on record. And what happens when it rains and we see a lot of heavy rainfall events is, you know, particularly in the transportation system, we begin to see gridlock, we begin to see slower speeds. And, you know, even on some roadways such as Washington Boulevard, we've seen people drown, right? So these create a lot of hazardous conditions, which impact the amount of time we're able to spend at home and could potentially put us in some dangerous situations. In addition to the environmental concerns, congestion also remains a big issue in many urban areas, resulting in drivers spending a lot more time on our roadways instead of with their family and friends, right? So for example, if we look at the top left, where we're looking at the average time for drivers spent in peak hour congestion, in Los Angeles, drivers are spending on average 100 hours a year in congestion. And if we look at New York City, the average driver is paying about 3,000 hours in congestion due to lost productivity and fuel. And this can be significant, especially for people in low income areas. And, you know, cities have tried to do a lot of things to solve congestion issues, right? By optimizing traffic lights, expanding the number of lanes on roadways, and expanding transit to reach more individuals. But the thing is, many of these solutions tend to be costly, and the issue of congestion still remains today. As of 2019, there were over 400 bike sharing systems in operation. Right now, we're beginning to see a lot of dockless, dock bike systems, and a lot of e-scooter systems. And we're seeing these systems in about over 190 cities across the US. And shared micromobility, while not climate neutral, does use less energy and emit less greenhouse gas emissions over their life cycle when compared to private cars. And in addition to a lot of the environmental and societal benefits, these cars tend to have similar speeds to, well, these vehicles tend to have similar speeds to cars during peak hour traffic, right? So considering far less road space in cars and the ability to meet similar purposes for short trips in modern cities, micromobility is seen as a viable and low-cost alternative to replacing many short car trips in urban areas. So that brings us to our question. Could e-bikes be the solution to reducing congestion and saving the planet? Right now, I'm going to walk you through a study that we did where we develop a method to estimate the upper bound potential for micromobility to replace short car trips and apply this to a case study in Seattle to estimate the resulting environmental and congestion benefits. In the past, there have a lot of planners who have tried to do this work through statistical modeling and surveys. And what we do is take a simulation approach to look at this issue using a different method. So in cities today, there's a large potential for micromobility. So for example, where we're at in Pittsburgh. So, Kristin and I are in Pittsburgh, right? And, I take the bus, some people bike, but, no matter what, we're still seeing a lot of trips being done by private car. So even in Pittsburgh, you're seeing 50% of trips between 0 to 3 miles. And even in cities like New York, where there's a lot of transit and people have access, you're still seeing a lot of private trips making these short car trips, right? And so a short car trip is between 0 to 3 miles, and these are the trips that we think would be viable to be replaced for micromobility, right? So there's a lot of trips being done in peak hour by these private vehicles. And in Seattle, where our case study occurred, we see about 52% of trips are between 0 and 3 miles. And then you start to see some other portion of trips between 3 to 6, 6 to 9. But the majority of them are concentrated between 0 to 3. And once you get out of that, the other half of the trips occurring there, right? And what happens when people start to take cars instead of bikes or transit is on the top right, you're seeing, 200 people in 177 cars. The cars are out of the picture at this point. They take up 4 to 5 lanes. So this creates a lot of congestion, as opposed to on the right, you have some bikes taking up 1 lane, and they're all riding 1 lane. So you could use this space to do something else. You can use this space for parks, for eating. You can do a lot of different things, right? And today, what also something we're seeing is bikes only occur for about 2% of trips, right? So notice I said that 50% could be replaced by bikes. But I think the thing we wanted to figure out was, okay, well, it says 50%, but there are limitations to this. And I'm going to walk you through some of those limitations and how you can go about estimating upper bounds to see how many trips can actually be replaced by micromobility. So this was our methodology for our study, right? And if you look on the right, it shows that we did a data analysis portion, which was trying to estimate the upper bound number of trips. We also had a traffic simulation portion, right? So after we estimated the upper bound number of trips, we applied that to our traffic simulation, simulated peak hour demand, and we were able to get our results on impacts to congestion, energy use, and emissions, right? So, if I walk you through some of the things we consider, right? So like I said, 50% is your starting point, right? But, some things that we had to consider were precipitation intensity, right? So if it's raining really hard outside, you're likely to see a big drop off in the number of people taking micromobility, right? So we considered some light rain conditions, as we thought people could prepare for some of these events, as they're really common in Seattle, right? Commuter age, 16 years of age. So a lot of these shared modes, you have to be a certain age to be able to ride these vehicles. So we considered age, wind speed. Wind speed is another thing that impacts safety, right? So we had to consider wind speed, and we also considered trip purpose, right? So you're picking up people, you're dropping them off, or you're doing some shopping. Micromobility is probably not the best mode to be used for some of those things, right? So once we went through all those filters, we found that about 18% of those short car trips could be replaced by micromobility modes, right? So if short car trips are 100%, 50%, then this is about 9% of trips, right? So we see that about 9% of trips that could be replaced by micromobility modes, right? So, and like I said, our case study was done in Seattle, and what you see in this graph are some of the freeways, urban arterials, and some of the traffic analysis zones that we looked at as part of our traffic simulation. And traffic simulation is done in the 5-county Puget Sound Regional County region, and this includes Seattle, right? And the point of us simulating the entire region is because we want to be able to capture the traffic that travels in, out, and around the city, as well as any traffic that passes through the city, right? And this simulation allowed us to do that. So in order to capture the effects of bikes that interact with the vehicle stream, during our simulation, we did 2 scenarios, right? There was a 2014 scenario where we looked at the current deployment of a bicycle infrastructure across the city. And there was another one where we looked at wide-scale bike deployment, meaning there's a bike lane from every single origin to destination pair, right? So according to the highway capacity manual, if there's not a bike lane available, then that trip, instead of it going from one car trip, it goes to 0.5, right? But if you have bike lanes everywhere, then all those car trips go to 0, right? And I'm going to show you an example of how we integrated some of these upper bounds into our simulation, right? So this is an example of an OD matrix. This tells you the number of trips going from each origin and destination pair, right? So from, for example, 1 to 3, or let's take 1 to 4, right? This, you know, in your third row right here, you see about 6 trips are going from 1 to 4. Now, if micromobility could replace all these trips and there were bike lanes, this would go from 6 to 0. If there is no bike lane, then this will go from 6 to 3, because you have to take into account the interactions with the private vehicle stream, right? And what so what we did was we used a static traffic assignment model, right? So there's a network component to it, which are the bike lanes and all the lengths and the travel speeds. And this is the demand component to it, right? So this lowers the demand into the network, right? So the more demand you have, the more traffic you're going to see. So when we simulated these two scenarios and we loaded this demand and integrated our micromobility penetration rates into our origin destination matrix and network model, we got this graph right here, right? So in the brown, you have your wide scale bike deployment scenario. This assumes there's always a protected bike lane there, so that all the trips go to 0. And in the grayscale, you have the 2014 bike lane configuration scenario, which assumes that, you know, if there's a bike lane, it goes to 0. If there's not, it goes to 0.5, right? And in 2014 in Seattle, there weren't a lot of bike lanes, right? And what we saw was that bike lanes are needed to maximize link performance. So, for example, at the 10% penetration rate, we only see about maybe a negative 1% decrease in the number of severely congested links when compared to our base case scenario if we don't have a lot of bike lanes. But once we increase the number of bike lanes, we're able to get to over a 5% decrease in the number of severely congested lanes. And you're seeing this all across the board, right? So any bike lane proponents out there and advocates, this goes to show you that if we're going to make this switch, then in order to see some of the benefits in terms of congestion, we need to make sure that these bikes are not interacting with the private vehicle stream. All right, and then we also did some congestion studies, right? And in the base case, you're seeing a lot of traffic, mostly downtown and on the highways. And what we did was we took 10% of the number of short car trips and reduced that based on the bike lane configuration, right? And what you're pretty much seeing here is that when there is not much bike lanes, you're able to get at most between a 1 and a 5% decrease in travel speeds. You're going to see most of your impacts on travel speeds on areas that were congested before. And that's just because of the volume delay function that occurs in the simulation. So what happens is areas that are very congested, if you add cars, they receive bigger impacts, but if you remove cars, they receive bigger benefits, right? So you're seeing a lot of the benefits around the downtown areas, around the highways, the 1 to 5%. But when you have wide scale bike lane deployment, you're able to see, instead of just a 1 to 5% increase in travel speeds, you're able to see up to 11% increase, right? So with more bike lane deployment, you can see greater increase in speed and less severely congested links. And one more question we had was, so where are we seeing these benefits, right? So, you know, we were able to see that urban arterials tend to benefit more than from short car trip replacement than do our freeways and expressways in terms of both link travel time and speed, right? So for example, in the dotted, we have our urban arterials, and on the side of the lines, we have our freeways and expressways, right? So for example, on mildly congested links, we're seeing at the upper bound penetration rate about a 0.4% decrease in travel time on our urban roadways, but on our freeways, we're seeing about between a 0.1 and 0.2. So, and this occurs because most short trips tend to happen on our urban arterials. So that's why we're seeing a lot greater impacts of those facilities than our freeways and expressways. And to one of the big questions we had, can micromobility be used to save the planet? So because micromobility looks at short trips and long trips make up a disproportionate share of peak hour emissions. So for example, right here, if we look at the upper bound micromobility penetration rate, we're only going to see about a 2% decrease in emissions and energy use, right? So short trips make up a disproportionately low amount of peak hour emissions and energy use. So we're going to need to do a lot more than just look at short car trips. I think micromobility is good for public health. And as you can see, it could have really big congestion benefits on some of our really congested corridors. We're going to need to do more on our to reach some climate change target emissions, right? But in conclusion, the potential for micromobility to replace short car trips is about 18%. So the majority of short car trips can't be replaced. There's a lot of limitations that come into play. So 18% of short car trips is only about 9% of trips. So we're still going to have 91% of trips occurring. So we're going to need to look at other things such as vehicle electrification to try to combat some of the trips that do occur. And bike lanes are needed to realize full benefits of micromobility replacement, right? So if we're going to ask people to, stop using cars, start using micromobility, we first of all have to make sure it's safe for them to do so. And if we want to realize the full benefits, we have to provide bike lanes. Otherwise, bikes are going to interact with the private vehicle stream. You're not going to see some of those congestion benefits that we outlined. And short car trips, they account for a disproportionately low amount of energy use and emissions when compared to the number of short trips that take place during peak hours. So putting some focus on our long trips and trying to best understand how we can have an impact on the number of long trips that occur as well is very important. And in addition to micromobility, other measures are needed to substantially reduce emissions. We talked about vehicle electrification of our light duty vehicles. You could also electrify your trucks, your buses. But yeah, in order for us to get to those climate change target emissions and reduce that 29% to let's say 20%, micromobility is a good start. It's good for public health. It can improve safety on our roadways. We have a lot of crashes that occur, but we're going to need to do more than that to meet climate change target emissions. And, before we go, I'll talk about one other project that I have going on. This one we're doing with POGO. They're revamping their system, and a lot of the motivation for this study is that, we're starting to see micromobility pop up in many places, and it can have a lot of positive impacts and get people to different jobs that they didn't have access to before, healthcare opportunities and healthy food access. But one thing we're seeing is that people in low-income and minority areas don't have access to these systems as much as their wealthy and white counterparts. And one factor contributing to this is inequitable distribution of services. So we wanted to develop a decision analysis tool that could be utilized by bike share providers to understand the impact of equity preferences on the choice between placing stations near populations and job centers versus areas with higher mobility needs, and to help them understand the resulting impacts on transit and job access for different population groups. Some of the overall conclusions are micromobility is good, but we're going to need to do more things such as vehicle electrification to get there. We need to figure out how to target our long distance trips as they make up a disproportionate amount of peak hour emissions. And there are other things that I think we can do for our shared operation systems, our siting decisions and rebalancing operations. The decisions we make there can have a huge impact on who's able to use and adopt shared micromobility modes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Corey. So if folks want to start entering any questions you may have for Corey into the chat, please go ahead. We have some initial questions we wanted to start off with. So maybe we'll dive into those and then we can get to any audience questions that we have. So I think one of the first things that I was thinking about during your presentation and in looking at your study is how can we be applying this research to other cities, like across the US, outside of the US, and can other places that are smaller or less dense than the Seattle region expect that same potential mode shift of 18% or 1 in 5 trips from personal vehicles to micromobility?
Well, that's a good question, Malia. I think that one of the reasons why we chose to do a static traffic assignment model is because many MPOs, pretty much most MPOs across the country use this, right? So, we took the Puget Sound Regional Council's model, but SPC uses a static traffic assignment model. The DC metropolitan region uses a static traffic assignment model. So I think the transferability of this framework can be applied in many cities, many regions across the US, and I think would be of interest to many metropolitan planning organizations. So I think there's a lot of transferability there. And, I think it helps them to incorporate micromobility into the long range planning of the transportation system, right? And I think that's something that's important. Now, will other areas, other cities experience the same benefits? I think that goes back to some of our filtering criteria, right? So in rural areas, you might have a lot more long trips than in your urban areas. In your urban areas, you might see a lot of short trips because things are really close by. But in your rural areas, you might see more short trips. So, there itself, you might get less trips. And on it also depends on the trip purposes in every region, right? So if people are doing a lot of shopping, that's going to impact the number of trips. The weather, right? So in California, if it's sunny, you might see you're able to replace more trips because in Pittsburgh and Seattle, it's raining a lot. People might not want to take their shared bike. So, I think, taking a look at that framework, seeing how your city fits into that framework will help you to get a better understanding of how many short car trips can be replaced. And one more thing I'll say, Malia, is we're actually taking this framework and using it to explore other questions and issues in transportation, looking at emerging trends. So, for example, we're taking this same framework and a similar model to explore what happens when people shift from, in-person grocery shopping to online grocery shopping and the impacts that could have on congestion, local air emissions.
Thanks for that answer, Corey. Another thing I was thinking about is one of the results of shifting people out of their cars to micromobility you saw was reduced congestion. Can you talk a little bit about the implications of this mode shift and those resulting higher speeds you looked at? Like, what are the safety implications? Does that then create a potential for induced demand? Or are there just more opportunities for how we use that curb space that's maybe opened up?
Right. So so what this study did was it looked at the roadway portion, right? So it looked at what happens when you remove cars from the road. I think one piece missing from a lot of simulations is the sidewalk, right? So once you start to replace these cars, if your bike lane is great, but I still see a lot of shared scooters and some bikes on the sidewalks, and we're kind of moving to the city where we're trying to have bikes, we're trying to have scooters, we're trying to have personal delivery devices as well. And so all these things are kind of going to take up some sidewalk space, and people are still going to want to use the sidewalk to do walking, to do recreation. So I think looking at impacts to sidewalk accessibility, mobility for different population groups is important. For example, there is a lot of testing going on at University of Pittsburgh, and with Starship Technologies, they have autonomous delivery robots. And there was one day where a young lady, a PhD student at University of Pittsburgh, she had a run-in with one of these robots, and she was actually stuck in traffic. She couldn't get out of the roadway. So I think as we start to make some of these shifts, looking at how this impacts mobility for different populations, and making sure that our sidewalks, our streets continue to be a safe place to be is something that we would definitely need to do. And, to some of the other points, I think there's probably more research on, that we could probably do on, what happens to people's route choices when this happens. Do they switch from some of the smaller collector roads to some of the higher speed urban arterials if there's less traffic? And, in terms of curve management, I think that there could be some, especially if we see a lot of private adoption, we probably would have to get some bike racks for people to put their bikes on, I know we don't want to clutter the sidewalks even more, but that gives me a question I wanted to ask you, Malia. So at Toole, have you explored ways that micromobility could impact travel patterns and curve management for local municipalities?
Well, one thing that we're working on right now is looking at kind of national guidance for how cities and agencies should kind of maintain facilities for micromobility. And I think that's a question that folks have is like, well, are bike lanes the right type of facilities for micromobility? These devices could be bigger, they could be heavier, they can go faster. And I think kind of what we're seeing is for on-street facilities, a scooter isn't really going to affect the facility any differently than a traditional bike, but in things like shared use paths and trails, maybe there is a need to create that separation and understand that folks that are going, 15 plus miles per hour shouldn't be in the same place as people walking or riding traditional bikes. And I think that's something that a lot of agencies are struggling with, is trying to understand how to incorporate this new mode. So I'm also curious what you think in terms of, you mentioned that protected bike lanes really helped with that mode shift, but what are the implications of having folks on e-bikes next to folks in traditional bikes? And how do you feel about kind of the way that we should approach this new mode as it's really growing in popularity?
Mhm. So, I think that, if we're going to encourage people to ride bikes, then, I think a feeling of safety is really important. So, I think that having a dedicated bike lane, and, especially, in certain areas is really important. So, maybe you want a buffer around those bike lanes to separate the car, or maybe there's some barrier. We did a study at Carnegie Mellon. So Carnegie Mellon, Forbes Avenue, which is the really big, the main street where Carnegie Mellon is, we made that into a complete street, right? So there used to be 2 travel lanes on each side, so 4 travel lanes in total. And they did a renovation, so there's 1 travel lane on each side and a middle turn lane. And before on Forbes Avenue, you rarely used to see bikes going there because people used to speed. We put another traffic light to slow some people down a little bit. And what we saw was a huge increase in the number of people that bike to work, the number of people that walk to work, the number of people that take transit. And we really didn't see that much decrease in speed. We saw benefits to local emissions. So I think that it can be done. I think that, your local universities, your places where you have a lot of jobs, your central business districts are great places to start. And in places, especially where maybe you can reduce the width of the lane some to accommodate some of these bikes would be great places to start.
Awesome. You started out the presentation kind of talking about how transportation broadly obviously contributes to emissions and climate change. And I'm curious, how does climate change potentially impact the number of these short car trips that could be replaced by micromobility modes?
So one big thing that we wanted to include in our analysis was weather. All right. So, and I guess it depends on where you are, right? So in Pittsburgh, we're seeing a lot more heavy rainfall events, right? So if you're in Pittsburgh, then there might be conditions where you don't want to take a bike out because it might be dangerous. There's a street in Pittsburgh, Washington Boulevard. People have drowned on this street, right? So taking a micromobility e-scooter or bike out in some of these really heavy rainfall events, people probably aren't going to want to do that. So if it starts to rain more than for example, in Seattle, that 18% is going to go down. So that's one way climate change could have impacts. Now, in places like California, where you might see more droughts or something like that. Maybe it'll go up. I know there's wildfires and things like that. I'm not too sure how they impact the transportation system, but in places where it may be raining less, maybe you might see the upper bound go up some. But I think micromobility is something that we hope could help us to meet some of those climate change emission targets, so that we slow climate change down. And the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're saying that we need to do a lot to make this happen. So like I keep saying, micromobility, electrification, I think will help us get there.
Yeah, and I'm interested in maybe digging into a little bit more of the limitations of micromobility's impact on emissions and climate change. You talk about just a 2% net reduction if, 1 in 5 car trips switch to micromobility. So you mentioned electrification, EVs in general. I'm curious if there are any other modeling you've done or just any policies you've seen for ways for cities and agencies and maybe even private operators of shared micromobility fleets that they could maybe improve that 2%? Is there a way with maybe we're rebalancing using EVs and bikes? Maybe the batteries get more efficient. I'm curious if you have thoughts on if that 2% can increase or if it really just needs to be done in a suite of transportation changes.
Right. Well, I think that the 2% I think you could increase it some. The thing is this, right? So micromobility, the life cycle emissions are already so much lower than private vehicles from a per kilometer standpoint, right? But to answer your question, I think some of the things you pointed out could improve it, such as using low emissions vehicles for balancing and charging. And we also need to improve our grid emissions too, right? So these vehicles have to charge and have to supply energy through batteries, right? So if we have a grid that's low carbon, that can improve the 2% to maybe 3 or 4, right? But I think in order to see really, really big, huge benefits to emissions, I think you're going to need to, because the thing is, the majority of trips are still happening, right? And the trips that they're replacing are short, right? And the trips account for a disproportionately low amount of greenhouse gas emissions because they're 0 to 3 miles, whereas you have people traveling 6 to 10, 18 plus, 30 plus, 50 plus. Those are where your emissions are coming from, right? I really think that there's a need to, medium and heavy duty trucks, right? To, start electrifying our trucks, right? And really start to target our long trips, which really account for the bulk of the emissions that happen, right? So, expanding transit commuter options to allow people that work in the city but don't live there to be able to come in, but not use their private cars, I think could be a really important thing. And making sure that we've seen a really big increase in e-commerce, especially during the pandemic, right? So having some deliveries being done by a cargo bike could be a viable alternative as well to help increase that 2%.
Thanks. Now we're going to move to folks who've submitted questions in the chat. Our first question that we have is, did you see an increased number of micromobility trips when paired with transit? And that was something that showed up on your last slide, but I think would be great to hear more about how transit fits into the equation.
So with this study, we didn't really, with the upper bound penetration rate, we didn't consider transit, but I think they're talking about the other study. So, all right, so the other study, we really kind of came about because of the agreement between Port Authority and Healthy Ride, right? And they had an agreement where if you ride a bus, you can use a Healthy Ride bike, another pogo, right? You can use a pogo bike for 30 minutes, right? So and when we talked to pogo, they said that that's a really big part of their ridership, are some of those people that are trying to connect to transit or trying to use transit to get to a job, maybe bike share can help them to get there, right? But I think the really big thing about connecting people to transit is, so the mobility options you have impact the job opportunities that are available to you, the impact where you're able to shop at, the impact, the healthy food you're able to access, right? So we wanted to, develop a tool moving forward that would help bike share providers say, okay, well, because bike share providers want to make sure that people are able to access the system, and they want to make sure it's being used to its highest capacity, right? Now, in some of those places where there's maybe high demand, high population, aren't places where people have high mobility needs, right? So we wanted to develop a tool that could help them to understand, okay, when you make these decisions, here's how people with high mobility needs are impacted. So it's kind of a trade-off between revenue and improving equity and mobility in the area.
So another question, we talked a little bit about transferability of the approach, but this is a question maybe about flexibility. So how flexible is this approach to scale? And this person notes that upper bound mode shift potential is a question of interest in regional planning all the way down to the facility level.
So, all right, so let's see, can you repeat this question? His or her question?
And maybe Barbara, if you're still on the line, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So the whole taking a look at the upper bound of mode shift potential is something that comes up constantly. It's basically a question that gets asked in almost every project, and in some of them we have the ability to look at it, and some of them we don't. But your methodology that you use to look at this, obviously you looked at it at a larger scale. How scalable do you think that is with what you used?
Let's see. So you mean looking at it on a larger scale, in terms of if we want to apply it to another area or something like that?
Well, so like if you wanted to zoom in and say, what's the mode shift potential of this one neighborhood or this one corridor?
Okay. So all right. So the overall was 18%, right? But we actually, I'll share my screen. We actually, one of the reviewers brought that up, and we actually tried to, we had an upper bound for a couple of different areas in Seattle, and what we're seeing is that the downtown has the most number of short trips. So you're going to see some of the greatest potential and benefits there. And West Seattle has 17%. So we did try to break it down, and we used a survey to try to see how the number of short trips varies by neighborhood and location. So that's one way to do it. PSRC, they do a spring survey every few years, and this allowed us to see, at a more granular level throughout Seattle, how the number of short trips varies and where most replacement will happen.
Thanks.
All right. This next question is about that separate research that you touched on at the very end, talking about transit and shared bicycle sighting synergy. And the question is, what other infrastructure elements should be in place to support adoption of e-bikes? And they're saying, for example, it's challenging to replace a 1 to 3 mile trip to the grocery store if the shopping center lacks safe and secure bike parking options. And I'm also thinking about your recommendation around cargo bikes, like if you don't have a way to bring your groceries home, et cetera. So maybe diving into talking a little bit more about cargo bikes. And then I think also around the transit and shared bike access question there. There's a lot there.
Yeah. So let me make sure I got this. So this is more about how do we make sure that there's proper infrastructure in place to replace some of these short trips. Well, like, for example, I know Pogo, and a lot of other bike share companies, I think they provide like a small basket or something like that. But, maybe in shopping areas, we can provide some cargo bikes or something for people to be able to replace some of those short car trips. This was one that I, kind of struggle with a little bit is, how do we make sure that some of these trips that aren't probably the most desirable to be replaced right now can be replaced. I guess it depends on how much people you're shopping for. If it's just me, I might be willing to replace my short car trip to the grocery store with a bike. But if I'm shopping for a family of 5, I don't know how much times I'd have to go to the grocery each week, but so bike share providers may be making some assessment of some cargo carrying capacity that could be done by these bikes, and I think marketing that to individuals, I think could help replace some short car trips that happen to the grocery store.
Great. And we have another question about kids, non-drivers. I know for bike share, they often require you to be over 16. So the question is, how did this or could this account for trips with children and non-drivers? Talking about how bike share usually just have single rider bikes, and what are some recommendations to include those kinds of trips?
Okay, yeah. Well, so let's see. Maybe there could be a child carrying a mechanism on the bikes that allows people with kids that want to take a trip to actually take that trip. So that could be something that bike share providers could think of. Right now, you have to be at least 16 to operate a bike. So me as a young guy at 13, or a young lady at 13 couldn't take the bike. They need to be assisted by somebody else. So maybe providing some 2-seater or 3-seater options could be a viable option to move forward.
Okay, I think those are all the questions in the Q&A, and we're almost out of time. So I just want to maybe give you, Corey, an opportunity to chat about any other exciting research you have going on. You mentioned at the end another study, but if there's anything else that you want to share, I know this group is super interested in all that.
Okay, well, I'll just, I've been working with Pogo, and, so I'll just maybe talk about one other study that we have going on, just so we're all aware of what we're doing in my lab. But, I think right now what we're focusing on is usage and adoption of the system. And, one thing that, so in our Seattle study, one thing we saw was that at any one point in time, most micromobility vehicles are not in use. And one thing that we wanted to do was improve the spatial mismatch of supply and demand across the region. And we've seen a lot of studies do this using some traditional features we have here on the left. But social media is also a sensor that can be used to try to improve the matching of supply and demand across the region. So we're working with Pogo right now to improve bike share demand prediction. But I think that's the last study I have. Going back to the purpose of this, can e-bikes reduce congestion and save the planet? I think it's a terrific way to go. I think from a congestion standpoint, it improves congestion a lot. I think from an emissions standpoint, we do see some benefit, but it highlights the need for other things. And I think from a public health standpoint, it's really beneficial for people of all ages to get out there, get active, and ride a bike or an electric assisted bike to work.
All right, well, thank you for those closing thoughts, Corey. It was really great to hear from you. I don't know, Kristin, if you want to say anything before we say goodbye.
No, this was really great to hear more about your work, and I can't wait for those next studies to come out. And thank you so much for doing this with us. This was fun. And we're, I think talking internally at Toole just about, how we continue some of these conversations. And I really appreciate you willing to come and talk to us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and thanks everyone who joined. I hope you have a great rest of your day and happy long weekend.
Yeah.
All right, bye everyone.